a threat to U.S. progress in AI innovation? David Carter is Industrial Senior Analyst at RSM US. Hello, David.
Hi, Bob. Good to be with you today.
Thanks very much for joining me. So, we are hearing that there are certain constraints that are limiting revenue growth in the U.S. data center industry, with a possible impact on artificial intelligence innovation. Tell me about that. What is going on out there?
It's interesting. So we're seeing for the first time in the last couple quarters of earnings statements from the big hyperscalers that they're really mentioning constraints around chip availability and electricity and even land
Hmm.
that are limiting their ability to grow their data center capacity. And so that's impacting their revenue growth and certainly AI capabilities here in the US.
Sure. Okay, well, let's take these things one at a time. Let's start with chip availability. There's a need for capital investment. We're seeing a concentration of manufacturing, but we don't have enough at this point domestic chip manufacturing capability. I thought the Chips and Science Act of 2022, it was definitely tried to address that, but it hasn't solved it for the short term. What's going on there? It just isn't ready yet to provide that solution.
Yeah, we're talking, complex long-term capital projects with complex supply chains that we have to work through.
Hmm.
Right now, global, some of the most complex semiconductor manufacturing falls onto kind of three main companies where they're designed in the US, they're manufactured in Taiwan with highly specialized equipment that's out of the Netherlands. And so
Oh.
the US has about 10% of chip making capacity. We're
Hmm.
trying to grow that to 30% by the end of the decade. And that's a tall order. We're talking about tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of capital that have to be allocated across different parts of the supply chain. And so, yeah, the Chips and Science Act, back in 2022, it started, but there's a long, long runway to actually building that out.
We don't often hear about the Netherlands being part of the equation, but that's interesting. What is coming from there? You say specialized equipment of some kind?
Yeah, it's called lithography equipment. That's really a key part of building some of the chips, some of the highest performance chips that are making our GPUs that go into AI.
Hmm. So is this indeed having an inhibiting effect on the growth of data centers that they simply don't have enough chips?
It is, chips are in demand for a lot of different pieces, not just for AI, but cryptocurrency mining and other
Oh yeah.
uses.
Hmm.
It's really exploding in demand, and so everybody's looking for the same amount of chips, and it just takes time to build up that capacity.
Okay, let's talk about electricity. AI obviously requires an immense amount of power, as does, as you said, cryptocurrency, blockchain, stuff like that. How serious are electricity shortages as an inhibiting factor on data center growth and operation?
So I'll frame it up this way. The US is grappling with significant growth in its electricity capacity compared to what we're used to. So if we go
Hmm.
back from, say, 1950 through 2007, we were used to growing our power demand by, say, about 4.7% per year. The next 15 years through 2003, we were roughly flat at 0.1% a year. Right now, we're talking about, generally speaking, across the US, 2 to 3% in power demand growth a year. Now, 2 to 3% doesn't sound like much, but compared to 0.1%, imagine trying to do anything 20 or 30 times more than what you're used to for the last 15 years. We've
Yeah.
lost that. We've lost that pace. We've lost that muscle. We're having to build up our supply chain. We're having to rethink through how we do regulation and build up all these different power capacity to meet the needs of data centers. But also, we're trying to increase our industrialization in the US through manufacturing and others. All of those things require power. And so we're in a place where, if we think about the data center companies, they all want to have green power, right? We think solar and wind, and low carbon power. But right now, their first priority is availability of power. And
Hmm.
so, we have to think availability, then reliability. Then we get to start thinking about how green is the power to serve our data center needs.
Yeah. I mean, in cryptocurrency alone, we hear that mining in some cases takes as much electricity as is required to power a small city. And we're not even talking about AI, like a single Gen AI inquiry can require immense amount of power to just to answer. So that sounds like it's a real crisis. What about land, though? I would have thought that we'd have plenty of land to build these data centers. Is that not the case?
Well, we have plenty of land. The question is, do we have the right land in the right places with the
Mm,
right capabilities around it?
hmm.
Data centers, one of the key pieces we have to keep in mind is that data centers are really tapping into a really complex ecosystem of chips, electricity. We're now using water to cool our high performance chips. And so now we have to have quantities of vast quantities of water to supply that. We have high speed internet connection to be able to get all this high volume of complex computations out into the world and back out to the users that are consuming it. And so to have all those pieces combined is really limits the scope of land that's available to do that, not to mention the labor that is able to be on site to support these data centers.
Yeah, I mean, we
Traditionally,
do.
we've had hotspots in, say, Northern Virginia and Texas
Uh-huh.
for data centers. That land is, I don't want to say it's running out, but it's getting far more in demand. It's getting much costlier. And so you have the hyperscalers that are looking to secondary levels, locations that have these capabilities, maybe not prime, but still meet those needs.
Meanwhile, obviously, some of the biggest domestic chip production initiatives are happening in the U.S. Southwest, essentially in the desert, requiring immense amounts of water. So interesting, a kind of a disconnect there, I would think. Okay, so finally, what about just general supply chain vulnerabilities that might be inhibiting data centers' attempts to operate, to grow, and to innovate in AI? What are we seeing there in terms of geopolitical trends and the like?
Yeah. You mentioned the CHIPS Act earlier, even the Inflation Reduction Act. There's this recognition, and it's not political at all, even though we're talking geopolitics, the challenge itself isn't political, where we recognize it's probably not in our best interest to be highly reliant on other countries around the world for critical elements that serve our economy and our national security.
Mhm.
And so these acts are kind of funneling in investment in the US to rebuild some of that capacity, whether we're talking about making chips, whether we're talking about mining for critical minerals and other certain capabilities. But all that gets back to the fact that we need that making those investments has a long time horizon. And so one of the things we're grappling with through this change in administration, even though we all agree that we need to bring this capability back to the US, the question is, how do we do that? And so there is uncertainty in the shift in US policies for, is this still going to be a priority? How, what is the right way to do this through credits and incentives and grants that are funding some of these capabilities? And then certainly tariffs come into play as well, recognizing that is, so for example, the Mexico and China are the number one and two suppliers of uh, finished computer goods into the US. And so, as we're talking about introducing tariffs into that and tariffs through other countries across Asia that are major suppliers of semiconductors, as well as thinking about some of the raw materials, steel and aluminum that go into making data centers and these big manufacturing facilities. All those pieces add not just uncertainty but increased cost
Yeah.
that make it challenging in the current credit environment.
Are we alone among the countries of the world in facing this crisis in all these things we've been talking about, or are other countries facing the same inhibitions in terms of their own data centers, their own innovation attempts in AI?
We share the same challenges as many of the countries around the world. I think we're feeling it in a more concentrated manner. 45% of all data centers in the world are here in the US. And so just by nature of having that concentration, we're feeling it more acutely.
Yeah. Well, as you point out, it seems like all the solutions we've talked about today are indeed long-term in nature. It takes years to put up a chip plant. It takes a long time to put up a data center, to find the right land, to find the right electricity and all that. So it's all a long-term play. But I mean, what solutions might be out there in the short term that would prevent the data centers from, having problems in the next few years?
A lot of this comes back to supply chain brain or supply chain planning, right? We're talking here on supply chain brain. And so we have to think about,
Right.
how can we plan ahead and look at, building up inventory, planning ahead for production and construction of some of these new facilities. Where do we have alternatives and where do we have some of those key dependencies that we need to plan around? Like I said, we can't fix these problems, acutely very quickly, but through, more planning and, that will allow us to be, better poised to deal with some of these issues.
Seems like fertile soil for some innovator to step up with some really amazing solutions, but maybe that's not going to happen, right? Are we putting too much faith in that whole idea?
I'm excited about the opportunity behind AI, recognizing that AI is creating a lot of these challenges, but
Hmm.
it's also going to present a lot of opportunities and creative solutions to problems. Right? It's already creating drugs that we don't know how they work, but they're working great. It's developing new solutions that we can't comprehend, but the machine knows how to do that. So I
Right.
think there's going to be lots of ways that AI is going to help create some of these solutions as well.
David Carter of RSM US, thank you so much for joining me to talk about some of the big issues that data centers in the United States face today in advancing innovations in AI. Thank you very much for being with me today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.